Rutgers football dominated Michigan State last Saturday, 41-14, to finish 7-5 overall. Its first winning regular season in 10 years, the most Big Ten wins in program history since joining the league 10 years ago, with 4. David Anderson's back to talk it over and to just kind of give some big picture thoughts on this program. David, some of your initial thoughts from that dominant performance in East Lansing in the snow by the Scarlet Knights.
Well, it all starts with a conversation we had during the preview that we have to owe credit to Greg Schiano. I mean, I can't believe, even having seen how many times he's gotten this team off the mat, but I was still amazed at how passionate they were in that game.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and then when you contrast that with Michigan State, who now is in all this controversy because of a comment Aiden Childs made after the game, in effect saying, like, I don't care about the fans, which is actually not what mattered. What he meant, he doesn't care how the fans view them. That doesn't impact like how he prepares or whatever like that. That got taken out of context. But the bigger thing that came out of it from the Michigan State standpoint was a theme that they had preseason, which was basically they're a team of mercenaries. That a lot of guys were brought in from the transfer portal and this and that. And then we contrast again. You're comparing that to Rutgers, who they're playing for Kyle Monungai. They're playing their tails off. And then it had me thinking about their offensive line even. And every guy on that Rutgers offensive line, plus Tyler Needham, who returned when he had no need to come back from injury to play in that game as a tight end even. Every guy in that offensive line was recruited by Rutgers out of high school in this game. And I think that just goes to show you, like, the backbone of your team does matter. Like, would you rather have, one Mel Tucker season that they had with Kenneth Walker and then have this turmoil that they faced for the last 2 years, or be Rutgers right now? And that's an interesting question, right? But, I mean, really, Rutgers clearly showed that the core bones of this program are there. And, again, I have to, hats off to Greg Schiano, who I would have been not able to motivate anybody after that Illinois game. But he got them to play, and even after giving up a touchdown on the first drive, they just kept coming after Michigan State. They just were relentless on both sides of the ball and special teams. So, again, obviously that's the biggest takeaway. It's just how proud coaches, fans, everyone should be of this team for that game and the end of this season.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think on paper, this is a team that Rutgers should beat. To your point, that this is year 5 of Greg Schiano. This is an established program, an established culture, and it looked that way very much on the field. And the fact that, I thought it was even more impressive. Michigan State was the team fighting for a bowl bid. Rutgers already had theirs locked up, but they fought to extend their season. Michigan State did not, and it just seemed like, they got off to that quick start, and as soon as Rutgers hit back, Michigan State kind of fell apart. And I thought I was really impressed. I thought with the offensive play calling in this game, we were texting back and forth about the snow and how much would they throw. And, I thought Calic Manis, again, he made some really big throws in key spots. Again, numbers aren't going to overwhelm you, but some of the plays they made and the receivers that stepped up, I think just, obviously it bodes well for the future. But to see guys, like Duff and Strong and Miller had some big catches, just to come through in the moments they did. Ben Black to bounce back after kind of an up and down freshman year. It was really just inspiring, I thought, from a passing perspective in the snow, to see this offense continue to impress and make key plays that were winning plays for this team.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about it, like you said, you can't look at the completion percentage in a game like that. I mean, anyone who watched the Nebraska-Iowa game, even the Ohio State-Michigan game, I mean, when the weather gets cold like this, it can get tough to throw the ball, hold on to the ball, not fumble. And Rutgers offensively did that. And I think they really did a much better job of taking advantage of something that was said on the broadcast, which is when and I think Larry Kay actually was talking about this postgame too, is when it's really cold like that, especially when there's snow, it's hard for defenders to get their footing. Mm-hmm. And I felt like Rutgers ran plays that took advantage of that, whereas I don't think Michigan State did. They really were not factoring in how you want you want to force defenders to change direction, and that makes it much more difficult for them. And I mean, from a passing standpoint, they completed enough passes to be able to just keep feeding the rock to Monungai, and actually playing complementary offensive football. And because, like you saw with Monungai, and this was also mentioned on the broadcast, like he has a plan every time he's attacking the attackers, especially DBs. And we talked about in the pregame, Michigan State's defensive backs were depleted. And we saw this happen with Rutgers as well this year. Sometimes that actually hurt more in the run game and run support than even in the pass game, because defensive backs have been covering guys in high school, but they may or may not be used to tackling guys in college, especially not guys who come in with attack plans and they're initially into contact. And so again, I don't know if Kyle Monungai could have been as effective if they would have had last year's passing game and not been able to at least complete enough passes to open lanes up for Monungai to have his third straight year with just destroying Michigan State on the ground. Again, I think they said it was his third best yardage performance, which is incredible because it just means the previous 2 years he just went nuts. So very impressive, again, for the pass game, which we'll talk more about that in the context of the greater season. But yeah, they did what they had to do. And I guess that's what benefit of having a coach and a quarterback who were at Minnesota, which is, even colder place to play more of the year.
Yeah, for sure. I think also just in terms of, it's funny with Monungai, like 2 years ago when they lost at Michigan State, that was a back and forth. That was one of Wimson's best games in terms of throwing through the air.
Yeah.
And Monungai was super effective in that game, battling with against Jalen Berger. But yeah, it was funny because it was just it was as relaxed as I've been watching a Rutgers football game in a long time. You never really felt after they got that stand at that fourth down stand 10 up 10-7, and then they go down and they score. It just never felt in jeopardy. And the way they laid the hammer down on that first drive of the second half, it was just well executed. They seemed very in control from the outset. And it was just really satisfying to see this team not only win, not only come through in a spot that, cements progress for the season, which I want to ask you next, but also the fact that they were able to do it so convincingly.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had my notes here, enjoyable game, which I can't even remember the last time I wrote that, because even in games against Akron or Howard, you're like,
special moments.
Is this team just more bigger and stronger? Or are they actually good? This was actually, the only time was when they got stopped after the great field position from the 1 and 2 yard line, which I felt like was kind of just karma from the week before for everyone that said that, Monungai should have stepped out of the 1 yard line. But, other than that, Rutgers got the ball back and they just could not be stopped, really. And again, even if they would have got stopped once or twice, they only punted once in the game. They had, I don't think, any turnovers. Let's say you get stopped one more time. I mean, you still cruise to a victory. And you contrast that with last year, Michigan State, who had a big lead, but it felt like that game was kind of neck and neck, even though Michigan State was up, I believe it was 24-6. This, when you were reversed, I guess it was 24-7 at one point, but it was like Rutgers just kept going. They went up, I guess it was 31-7, and you're like, yeah, I mean, it was never in doubt. Past that, once they were up 17-7, I would say.
So let's take a minute. I think it's fair. A Jay Patel appreciation comment from both of us. 11 straight made field goals, 4 for 4 in this game, including, I believe, it was a 42-yarder at one point. There was a second one. Super impressive, not only in this game, kicking in the conditions in which he did, but also the way he persevered through that early struggles in the season. We talked about, we didn't think the coaching staff did him a lot of favors in terms of the spots they were putting him in. And he just kept his head down, kept working, and just got better and better as the season went on, and really culminated in this real standout performance in this game. Because you could argue, if he didn't kick those 2 late field goals going into the half, there isn't nearly as much separation between these two teams. So I really thought his contributions were impressive, not only for what it was in the conditions they were, but also just what he's been through and how he's bounced back. And to finish the season 11 of 11 really was fantastic to see from him.
Yeah, I guess. I guess it was wrong on my calculation there. It wasn't 24-7. It was 23-7
Yeah,
because
they
of all
went
the
for the
field
two.
goals. Yeah. And then they went for it for a 2-point conversion later. That's what got them back on the track. But yeah, I mean, I think the bigger takeaway, the macro takeaway is how important that time is right before the half, which, is a Bill Belichick special. Basically, win the 4 minutes going into the half and the 4 minutes coming out of halftime was one of the things that the Patriots did so well during that stretch of unprecedented winning. And when you looked at this game, clearly Rutgers for the second year in a row just completely outcoached Michigan State in from a coaching standpoint and all of the situational football that came up. And I mean, I'm not saying Michigan State did terrible, but Rutgers was really on point with their decisions, moving the clock and making sure they had time, get the field goal. I mean, really, 27 was good enough, but then, they made a lot of good decisions from a clock management standpoint, moved the ball and then set up for that field goal that, yeah, I mean, it was not an easy kick, but he felt like he had just made one. And this was, they had all the momentum and, Rutgers just managed that. And like we talked about all over the season was this coaching staff was not perfect. They did make some mistakes for sure. Some of them eventually caught up to them in the middle of the year. But in these last 4 games, other than that last sequence against Illinois, which we litigated to death, other than just that one play, really, this coaching staff has been very good with clock management, situational football, personnel groupings, just at another level from what their opponents were in this last 4 weeks. Whether it be changing the defensive front or going forward receivers, and somehow a coach who coached with you was not ready for it against Minnesota. They did all these little things, putting Tyler Needham at tight end because they had no tight ends for blocking. These little things, and you saw it all encapsulated in that sequence going into the half that I think really demoralized Michigan State, because anybody who was really not a super prideful guy in a Spartan uniform was just bled by 1,000 cuts at the end of that first half.
Yeah, well said. Any last thoughts on the game itself?
No, I mean, other than just congratulations to the seniors, and for anybody who might not be playing in the bowl game because they're preparing for the next level or whatever reason, you can't go out with a better game than that.
Yeah, and I thought Shiano put it best in his post-game locker room speech, talking about the seniors, in their 5th year. It all started at Michigan State in 2020, his first game back when they won that wild game for 7 turnovers, and just talking how it all came full circle. I thought that was really cool that he brought that up, and certainly kind of puts a bow on a lot of the seniors' careers from that perspective. And yeah, it's just great to see them be able to lead this team back after the week that they had the week before. And that leads to our next point: 7-5, 4 wins in the Big Ten. That does legitimately, you can't argue that progress was made this season. You can argue that it wasn't the amount of progress that we had hoped for or that we should have expected, but they were able to get off the mat, win 3 of the last 4, and get to those key markers. I thought that we've talked a lot about how important that was to do just for the long-term health and vision of the program. Overall, I guess, what are your kind of, I guess, overall feelings in terms of success for this season, frustration? How has that balanced it out for you?
Yeah, like most things in life, you can't. It's not
Right.
really a total extreme on either way, right?
A little bit of both.
I mean, the takeaway for me as a fan is just there were enough high moments that it was a fun season. I mean, you can even argue it was more fun than last year in the sense of the win against Washington was real fun. Obviously, the Virginia Tech game was infuriating, but for the first 3 quarters or 2.5 quarters of that game, you're like, man, Rutgers has really never taken it to Virginia Tech like this, except for, last year a little bit. And so, there was definitely some high moments. And I think as a fan, you got to remember, there's really 2 facets. One is, does your team reach championships or whatever their ceiling is, which last year 6-6 was their ceiling in the regular season. And we act like, that was like in some ways a better season than this. It wasn't. I mean, they got obliterated by everybody except Ohio State that was any good. And so, but that team did max out kind of where they could have been, other than, maybe if they would have snuck upset against Ohio State. Whereas this team, they didn't max out where they could be. But then the other facet is like, was it a fun season? Was it an enjoyable season? I'll give an example of, I think it was the 2017-18 like Brooklyn Nets. Like they made the playoffs. They ended up winning the first game against the Sixers, and then they got swept off the map in that Turnpike series. But like that was a pretty enjoyable season as a fan. And this was kind of felt like on that level. Like they could have done more. Obviously, if you just would have beaten Illinois, which again you can talk about, like they could have beaten Nebraska, they could have beaten UCLA, like, and if they played those teams right now, I'm sure they would win. They'd be favored on a neutral field. But the Illinois game, literally the game was over. So if they just had that and you finish the season 8-4, we'd be like, yeah, they could have gone 10-2 or even 11-1, like we talked about preseason, but like it just would look optically better. Whereas I'm more looking at that this was good football, which was fun. And that's kind of the biggest overarching takeaway from these last 4 games. That's why I want to ask you, was this the best 4? When was the last time Rutgers put together 4 straight games that were this good? Obviously, it's clouded by a decade in the Big Ten where you never go 4 weeks in a row without facing Michigan, Ohio State, or Penn State. So it's very hard to put a 4-game stretch together. But, let's say this best 4 or 5 game stretch, like when's the last time they played this well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember back to 2012 when they started 7-0. I can't remember some of those wins before then, but you had mentioned, the amazing year when they started 1-5 and won the last 7. Was that 2008?
Yeah, Teal's last year.
Teal just became like John Elway, and they just obliterated people. That Louisville game, 56-5, I think. So yeah, I would say I can't remember. 2012 doesn't jump out to me in terms of signature wins or dominant wins, but 2008, I think you're right. That jumps out to me as when you felt like they were just steamrolling teams and really couldn't lose after such a frustrating start to that team. And that was kind of, 2012 was also, you were happy, but you were frustrated because they could have done so much more. 2008 was like that as well. So I think that this team and this season is kind of in that neighborhood and on par to that. Obviously, 2012, they were co-Big East champs. But I think just in terms of context of the progress we were hoping to see, Rutgers wasn't that far away from making, really substantial and notable progress that would have, unfortunately, would have changed perception, I think, across the Big Ten. And they haven't hurt perception, but they haven't done as much positive changes to it as they could have.
Yeah, that's why that Illinois game, again, is so crushing, because if you just finish 5-4, you're in a better bowl game. You're almost guaranteed at maybe the Citrus Bowl, because you would have had a head-to-head win against Minnesota and Illinois, who were basically the teams up there. You didn't play Iowa. So basically, or at worst, even if you don't get the Citrus Bowl, you're looking at Music City, probably at worst Duke's Mayo Bowl, all of which would be a better look, from a perception standpoint, than what ended up happening ultimately, which they could still end up in one of those. Obviously, I'm lobbying for the Duke's Mayo Bowl. Then I don't have to go anywhere. You guys can come visit me. But yeah, like I think the takeaway is just the what could have been. But when you look back, I mean, yeah, we all know Rutgers has been the worst team in the Big Ten in the last decades. That's obvious. But even in the last 5 years since Shiano came back, they have the worst record. They were tied, I think, with Indiana, who, oddly enough, did better than Rutgers this year. So now they're last again, I think, unless Maryland maybe drop below. I got to go to the stats on that. But, we can't fool ourselves that all of a sudden you're going to go and be amazing. Like, I think last year we kind of talked about this a little bit in the offseason, but they kind of skipped a step, which was they went from not even being competitive to not only being competitive, but winning toss-up games.
Yep.
So there had to be some regression. And I do think the team took a step forward this year, for sure. I mean, just look at their offensive passing attack, like you mentioned for the game against Michigan State. So there's that. I mean, it was definitely more entertaining football for that standpoint. And you can't just expect that, like, the team is just going to all of a sudden vault themselves. As I've harped on all year, if you look at college team talent in the Big Ten versus like all the talent on their roster, Rutgers in 17th place. Now, Illinois is in 18th, and they obviously are, in 4th or 5th place in the conference. So it's not that it can't be done with good coaching, but to think that all of a sudden Rutgers is going to just vault themselves without going on a generally steady progress is kind of lunacy. It would have been nice if they went 10-2, but even if they went 10-2 or 11-1, I think that helps your perception, maybe your recruiting in some way. But that they would have been playing the same level of football in these last few weeks than they ended up playing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which you could argue makes it more frustrating because they did kind of achieve a higher level, but they weren't consistent enough. They lack consistency all year. They weren't able to put complete games together. If the offense was clicking, the defense wasn't, vice versa. Just something to think about just in terms of if they had beaten Illinois, there would only be 5 teams with a 6-3 or better conference record, and they would have been in a mix with Michigan, Minnesota, and Illinois at 5-4. So they would have been clearly top half of the Big Ten, and in that second group, right behind everybody else, kind of the elite core, and then Iowa sitting there at 6-3. The other thing that I wanted to point out, which I texted you at some point this week, there was obviously 3-3 in one score games, toss up games, but in terms of their wins, right? They beat in terms of Power 4 wins. They beat a team with a 4-8 record. They beat a team with a 5-7 record, 2 teams at 6-6, and a 7-5. And then their losses: 2 5-7s, 2 6-6s, and a 9-3. So if you look at it from that perspective, they were really close. I mean, it's crazy how they got blown out by Wisconsin, who ended up, kind of flaming out ago and all that. That might just been time, whatever, the way the injury situation was. Of course, you have to account for injuries, but it's hard not to think about what could have been. I think, again, you appreciate the progress that was made. I think you have more confidence in the coaching staff from a motivational standpoint. And to their credit, this team did develop much better in the last month than they did in October. And I guess the concern, at least in my thought, was they seemed to get a little blindsided by the lack of development in October, but they did correct it, I think, through that bye week and in November. So that is very important and laudable in terms of them being able to do that. But I guess going into a year such as important as this, where you have the schedule that's never going to be this good, at least for a long time,
ever.
It's hard to, I mean, I guess to put it this way, right? If you said on August, 28th, that Rutgers is going to go 7-5 and fans would be petitioning to make the Duke's Mayo Bowl, would you consider that a success? I think more than half would say no.
I would say here's a good question though. If you asked that in August, they would say no. If you asked that a year ago, when we weren't even sure, is Mo Toure coming back? Is Kamanunga coming back? Does this team even have a tight end on the roster? If you asked it a year ago, let's say right before the bowl game against Miami, I think people would have signed up for it. But you're right. If you asked it in August, especially before Mo Toure went down, even after Mo Toure went down, I agree. It's funny you mentioned those 2 points because I had them as my 3rd and 4th bullet point in here. Pretty much our fears were right that there might not be enough depth at the linebacker. The offensive line might not be able to handle injuries. The pass rush, if you're already missing Toure, and if you're missing Lewis or Bailey, it ended up being both. Like, they have no pass rush. And then wide receivers, are they going to drop passes? They can be reliable. All those things were a problem in October, all of them. And then the coaches, to their credit, they came up with a way to correct these things to win 3 out of 4 Big Ten games. That's one. And then the other one was just development. Like we act like the development of the players is like very linear, but it's actually not, because a guy getting his first serious action is that there's a big curve between his first start and his second start, or his first year starting and his second year starting, or his first year getting his first just stretch of getting meaningful snaps at all. And so by the time November rolled around, health improved some, but health didn't even fully improve from this team. But these other guys had they kind of just are all baptized by fire at the same time. And that was really one of the key factors. I mean, look at Jabome. He finished. He got third team All Big Ten from, I think it was the media.
Yes.
And there's a guy who was great, was bad, and was great again at the end. Like, he kind of was the exact, trajectory of this whole team. And again, to the players and coaches' credit, they bounced back from it. There's plenty of scenarios where this team could have gone 4-8. I mean, let's talk about, how many teams just completely imploded this year? Like NC State, everyone thought they were going to have a good year. Florida State.
Yep.
I mean, we mentioned that in a previous podcast. You go from a decision away from being in the college football playoff of 4 teams to just the worst season they've had in decades, really. And so it just goes to show you how quick that can happen. And so the fact that Rutgers has a core bones of their program to bounce back like this, I mean, that does matter. But again, like, this is still not a perfect team. We're not grading on a curve anymore. But this team clearly has deficiencies, even in these wins at the end of the year. And so, all that being said, I think this comes back to one thing that I kept harping on the preseason as my biggest fear, which is, did this team, especially the defense, have enough guys who were fast relative to their position? And this is a position, a comment I make a lot, and sometimes gets taken out of context because I don't think I make it clear for first-time listeners. But like Flip Dixon, I love the guy as a player, right? But he's not fast for his position. If he was playing linebacker, he would be fast for a linebacker. But as a safety, he's like average speed, and he relies on his intelligence, his toughness, playmaking, pre-snap reads, all of these sorts of things. So when you're playing, but if you don't have anybody who is an elite speed guy at their position, which you could argue Max Melton and Deion Jennings were last year, then it puts a lot more pressure on everyone else to be perfect, to tackle perfect, because the assistance isn't coming as fast. So blitzes have to get home quicker because not everyone's going to be able to cover as long. Like, all these things add up, and it all collapsed like a house of cards in the middle of the season. But again, this coaching staff, to their credit, like you keep harping on, they figured out how to coach this team at the end of the season with the personnel that they had, what was available to them. And that's probably the most encouraging thing, is they did figure it out. But now you can't then forget you did a good coaching job and not acquire better talent. Again, like you have to, it sometimes goes both ways. Like you saw with the Giants with Brian Daboll having early success. They thought they were better than they were, but that was because the coaching staff was patching all these holes, and then all the holes show up. Right. Yeah. So, it's like a balance too, because you want to do a good job coaching in the moment, but you can't then miss that you have some of these problems that you need to address, especially heading into next season.
Yeah, all good points. And to be fair, there is a flip side to that coin. If you asked 7-5, hoping to go to the Duke's Mayo Bowl before the season, most people would say that would be disappointing. But if you asked it on Halloween, everyone would have signed up for that. So to be
everyone
fair,
would have signed up for 2 more wins, 1 more win even, and we got 3.
Yeah. There was a lot of winless out, talk, and I mean, listen, they didn't give a lot of reasons for confidence at that point. But I think we both recognize that you could see something with Cali McMahon is starting to build, and you could see that. And I think that for me, in terms of we're talking big picture and next steps for next year and everything, is one thing we had to see this year. We really wanted to see was that the offense took a major step forward, and there is a identity there now. And it's not just the handoff to the best running back in the Big Ten, or arguably second best, and just, beat teams up. Like they have real concepts now in the passing game. They have real weapons in the passing game with Ian Strong, who really emerged, KJ Duff, obviously Demir Miller. This is his last year, but Ben Black, There's others as well. I mean, there's real hope now that going into next year, Calic Manis, and this receiving core that we just mentioned, they can take another step forward and give this team a different dynamic. And we've talked about for years that Rutgers is, why would top recruits want to come play offense for Rutgers? Well,
Right.
now I think Shiraka in his second year, I mean, he did a good job. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't great, but he did a good job. And like you said, they figured things out in the end. And I thought his just ability to get the most out of his personnel really shined through. And hats off to, obviously, in terms of Dave Brock as the receivers coach and the development he did. And then the offensive line, Flats, just keeping them together through, really string and silly putty with the way that injuries were adding up for the offensive line. So I think there was a lot of positive. And you have a really young, exciting core of running backs now with Raymond looking really good in that Michigan State game. We saw Benjamin flashes. So I think for me, that's the most exciting part I have for this team going forward, is that the offense, this isn't the end point. I think this is a leaping off point, and they can only get better from here.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of goes into, was it watchable, fun football? Yes. And a lot of that comes from the offense, because you knew, hey, if they got punched in the mouth a few times, or if the other team was selling out to stop the run, well, that didn't mean the game was over. Like even last year it was. I was just checking as you were talking, because we talk about, for example, why would people want to come and play offense here? Well, if you compare Kenny Britt, his freshman year stats, to KJ Duff's freshman year stats, they're pretty similar. And if Duff can get like 75 yards in the bowl game, I think he'll match the yardage total more or less as well. Britt had 29 catches for 440 yards. Duff so far this year, 25 catches, 375 yards. And Duff had 1 TD, Britt had 2. So there's a guy who became a top NFL draft pick who kind of forced his way into the field. And it was a very similar thing to what we saw from Duff this year. I think also when you look at what might have been, we talk about Christian Dremel's lack of utilization early on. And I think that was one of the areas where the coaching staff actually was correct in terms of that teams were kind of maybe would be more likely to cover him. He was also hurt early on. And so it wasn't until the emergence of Strong, Duff, and even being able to use Ben Black a little bit more that I think it opened things up for Dremel to be a good contributor late in the year. I think there is one area where the coaches realized, like, we're going to have to go with more physically talented guys. And then once those guys got it going, then they were able to feed it to Dremel a little bit more, especially when they went to 4 wide receiver sets, kind of out of necessity. So I think that the offense, the passing game, like, this was the most passing yards they had in a season since at least 2014.
That's what I'm looking up right now.
And when you look at Ethan's stats, he's, if I'm remembering right, he was basically between like 8th and 11th in almost every statistic for a Big Ten quarterback, whereas Rutgers hasn't had that since Gary Nova was one of the top passers in the Big Ten in 2014. But when you look at that team, one of the reasons Nova had so many passing yards is because they couldn't run the ball at all against anyone good. They didn't have a common young guy. I mean, that team went through an injured Paul James, an ineffective, fumbling Desmond Peoples, until they eventually settled on Josh Hicks and Robert Martin as true freshmen. But that's also one thing for Ethan. Like, if he could have thrown for more yards if the team was actually worse, and statistically he might have looked better. Obviously, he might have had more interceptions, but definitely encouraging and watchable football. And one of the funny things I wanted to mention to you is preseason, we were like, we're worried this team doesn't have 4 scholarship QBs on it. And it ended up that they didn't even need more than one, which is crazy when you look at it. Like, sometimes you just kind of get lucky with injuries, even at the quarterback spot, where, AJ Serace didn't take a snap and Johnny Shepard was barely needed to play. We could argue that maybe he should have played during that losing streak a little bit, maybe some goal line packages or something like that. Maybe even now that they got stuffed at the 1-yard line a bunch of times against Michigan State, maybe that's something they consider for the bowl game or moving forward. But, it just, we forget a year ago, we didn't even know if Wimsatt was going to be back. Then they got Ethan, and then we weren't sure how good he was going to be. And then he delivers a performance that was at least middle of the pack Big Ten that gave you a chance to win basically every week except for Wisconsin, because that was just a debacle on all fronts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that jumps at me, I mean, listen, his completion percentage that's the one area. If you look at the rest of the Big Ten, he's second to last of all the Big Ten starters. But 17 touchdown passes, 6 interceptions. I don't have time to totally look it up now, but I mean, Nova only had one season of single-digit interceptions. And
Right.
even a great year in 14 when he finished third in passing efficiency in the Big Ten, he still threw 12 interceptions.
5 in 1 game.
Yeah, and I think 4 in another, maybe. I can't remember.
Oh,
But he had
yeah.
327 attempts, 22 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. And then you're looking at Ethan, and he had 363 attempts, 6 interceptions, 17 touchdowns. So the yardage, he was at 24.59. That's Calic Menace. And Nova was almost 3,000 at 28.5. So not like saying, it's comparing, but he's clearly the best quarterback since. Although Laviano, if you look at Laviano's stats in 15, they're pretty wild.
Well, again, but they were losing most of
Yes,
so many games.
a lot. The
I
whole
mean, he had one. They won one Big Ten game. This team won 4.
Yes,
So
playing complementary football, and I just thought for a team that lacked consistency throughout the year, he did bring a level of consistency that I think almost kind of allowed the team to get their footing, especially to get through October. They were those last couple of games they were still competitive in those disappointing losses after getting shellacked by Wisconsin, so it didn't completely fall apart. The offense was able to score points, and then they got their footing in that bye week, and then in November they were clicking. But I think I just think his contribution, as great as Kyle Monangai was and is and will always be, now number 2 rusher all time, first team unanimous all Big Ten first team offense for Rutgers ever. I think Calic Manis it's still an underrated season from the attention he's gotten. I just feel like maybe it will age even better over time, but also super pumped for what he could do next year too.
Well, the other thing we'll say is Gavin Wimsatt ran for 497 yards last year, and Ethan Kalikmanis ran for 233. So, I mean, he wasn't clearly as much of a threat, but it wasn't like he gave you nothing in the run game. And
True.
To your point about Monangai, we should just mention Kyle Monangai, first team All Big Ten for media as well as coaches. Holland Pierce earned second team for both as well. And I was trying to think if any Rutgers lineman has ever even finished first, second, even third team. I'm not sure. Yeah, we have to check that. I'm not sure if maybe Jonah Jackson would have been an all Big Ten performer. Obviously went on to be a fairly early NFL draft pick after a year at Ohio State. But other than that, it was Monangai first team for coaches and media. Pierce second team for coaches and media. Jabome was third team for the media, but not the coaches. And then if we talk about honorable mentions for offense, I believe it was Gus Zelinskis was 1, Kobe Asamoah got it, and then Ian Strong for one of the 2. Special teams, Austin Riggs was honorable mention. Jay Patel, I don't believe, earned honorable mention for either after being third team All Big Ten for the media last year. So obviously, that's one thing of note. And then defensively, other guys who received honorable mention was from the defensive side, Aaron Lewis, Keontae Hamilton, Robert Longerbeam, Shaquan Loyal, and Tyreen Powell. So a lot of that was based on injuries for Lewis, Longerbeam, Loyal, and Powell. I believe Keontae Hamilton was the only one who got it for both coaches and for media. So decent showing. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is, Monangai earned that first team nod. And then, Holland Pierce having a lineman finish second team All Big Ten is something Rutgers has not had. And unfortunately, that's something they're going to have to replace heading into next season. Any other thoughts on the All Big Ten selections?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of touched on this earlier, but I think Keontae Hamilton had the best year overall from any defensive player, just from a consistency standpoint, from an impact standpoint. He had moments pretty much in every game. and
Yeah.
really just kind of emerged this year. So you want to talk about development. A lot of times we focus on the younger guys becoming names, but he's a guy that we were very excited about his freshman year. He stopped wrestling, and we kind of expected him to make a leap. Didn't really for a couple of years, and then this year I think did so in a big way. So that's obviously props to the coaching staff, but also super encouraging to see him be able to do that. And just thought he deserved. I was hoping he'd get more than honorable mention, but overall, certainly deserves to get recognized by both media and coaches. And I think that leads to kind of, I think, listen, we'll talk more about the bowl game. It's speculation at this point. We don't even know who's going to play. We don't know where they're going to go. I think the most important thing that we both want to talk about is the time that this program will have now from a developmental standpoint, how key that is now for developing the rest of the roster and moving forward towards next year. So wanted to get kind of your detailed thoughts on that whole thing.
Yeah. So in terms of bowl prep, obviously people mention it's the equivalent of a spring practice in terms of the number of practices, especially if they go to Duke's Mayo Bowl, which is January 3rd. They have like a full month from we're recording this on Tuesday, December 3rd. So that's a lot of time to do that. And I think the biggest takeaway, if we start out, let's say I'll start on defense. And so on defense, without either Toure, Lewis, Bailey, they don't have a pass rusher. I mean, can Walker develop more as a defensive end? He led the team in sacks this year. Great story, but wasn't even on the two deep. If we're talking spring practice last year, maybe even right before the season. But then on the defensive backfield, I think when you saw that when they didn't have in the secondary either at least two of Flip Dixon, Rogers, and Longerbeam, when they didn't have at least two of them on the field, they really struggled. Two of them healthy, I should say.
Yeah.
And all those guys are gone. So does Kaj Sanders, who had a nice freshman season, does he become that indispensable leader in the secondary? Does Bo Masco become a shutdown corner? Like, who are the guys who are going to be the go-to key players on this defense next year? Yes, Mo Toure should be coming back from injury. Wesley Bailey, we hope, is coming back from injury. I mean, Toure has a young son, I believe, who, I mean, if he thinks he's going to be getting a better move for his family to go to the NFL, like we think he's going to be back, but even if he is back, we need other people that are going to step up especially in the spring practice to be leaders of this defense. Who is it? I don't know. I mean, Sanders is a logical choice, but who else is it? Who are those guys that are going to be the key communicators on that defense as well? Again, especially because Tyreen Powell is headed for the NFL himself. So who can those guys be? Ideally, you want them to be your most physically gifted guys, maybe like an Antonio White, who we didn't really see this year. But if not, I mean, you need leaders of your team, whether or not they're your most physically gifted players. Kaj Sanders is a guy who had the physical tools that he was able to play from the very beginning, and then you saw him improve as the course of the season. That's basically my biggest question is who are those guys, and can you identify some of them during bowl practice? I think Jabome was a guy that kind of was a sneaky one last year and in the spring, and then we saw him, he had some ups and downs, but ultimately he had a good season, was recognized by, especially the media, was top 5 in the Big Ten in tackles. Offensively, I think, like you said, it's a little easier to see who those guys are going to be. It should be Ethan Kelly-Kamanis. It should be Ian Strong. It should be, Gus Zielinski as your center coming back, you'd think, right? But you do lose Holland Pierce. Brian Felter will be coming back from injury. He's a leader, but is he going to be full go when training camp starts? Tyler Needham's flashed some potential as well. He seems to be healthier. Like, who are those guys on offense that are going to replace the heartbeat of Kyle Monangai and the leader of your offensive line with Holland Pierce? Like, we need who are those guys going to be? Can these bowl practices, and can we see it in the bowl game so that people, whether it be fans or coaches, feel good heading into spring practice? I mean, these bowl practices are key for this team, probably more than any other year I can remember Rutgers going to a bowl game because of how many guys they're losing on both sides of the ball that have been key contributors for years.
Yeah, and I think the performance in the bowl game, win or lose, but how some of those younger guys play is so important to their confidence level and to kind of really get them off going in a positive way in the off season. We've talked about how many, just the sheer numbers of scholarship players they're set to lose to graduation. Obviously, National Signing Day is this week, and we'll have more on that when that class is officially inked. But potentially some, I would think over half are going to enroll early, so they'll be in the mix of spring practice. But there's going to be a lot of things to watch in terms of development and kind of the depth chart. Not that we'll actually get a real one on paper, but just in terms of speculative. But yeah, this is a much different offseason than last year. And I think that they have to hit the ground running. And to your point, it starts now, because I think to have at least 2 good weeks of bowl prep, again, regardless of how they play in the game as a team, because I think it will depend who's there, who they're playing, matchup, all that. But if you have certain guys that you need in certain positions that step up and show you something in practice and show you something in the game, then I think optimism grows, because we hate to belabor the point, but I mean, that's scheduled next year. I advise you not to look at it in terms of a Big Ten perspective, because it is brutal. Based on someone did the Minnesota, Dan Gopher Insight. I've had him on several times. He has a tweet where he added all the Power 4 wins of each Big Ten team in terms of the teams they beat and what their records were against Power 4 opponents. And Rutgers, I think, plays the 2nd or 3rd highest total next year in terms
brutal.
of teams that had Power 4 wins. So it's going to be daunting. Obviously, the transfer portal is going to be a big part of that as well. But you're right. I think for me, more than anything, is what's going to come from these next 2-3 weeks of bowl practice, and how will that impact this team going forward?
Yeah, I mean, really, the lasting impression that we should have of this team, the 2024 team, is this last stretch of games. And if I just threw the record out and we just showed you the tape of the last 4 games, would you feel like this team is in a good spot as a program? And the answer is absolutely yes. So again, we can say, was it the best stretch since 2012, 2008, maybe even 2006, possibly, because I mean, obviously the 2008 team was playing the Big East. We know that this is a much tougher conference, but I think it would have been nice to get another win or 2, even 3, to feel good about it. But in terms of how they played, they're playing good football right now. Whether that happens in the bowl game, to your point, it's tough to say. But this team is worth watching. They're a legit Big Ten team for the first time in a decade. I mean, last year they got run off the field by the bigger boys in the conference. So this is definitely, like you said, a step forward, but it wasn't 2 or 3 steps forward.
But I think from a perception standpoint, from a messaging standpoint, with recruiting, we talked about, you build yourself as a developmental program. You have to show progress in the last stage of development for many players, many key starters, and they did. And I think the fact that they were playing their best football at the end, despite all the injuries, despite the kind of the missing spots of development earlier in the year, they showed how they were able to correct some of that. I think that's a good vibe, a good story, a good sell going into recruiting season as you look to lock up this 2025 recruiting class. And just in terms of moving forward, how high school coaches view this program, recruits view this program. There's reasons for them to have confidence in this coaching staff and the direction of the program, and you had to have that regardless of what the record was. And they were very close to not having that at all, and it being the flip side of kind of a disaster. So I think all in all, that for me is a big takeaway in that. They proved that they are a successful developmental program. They got the most out of their guys at the end, and now they have a lot to replace, but that they've shown that they can get them there, and now they just have to do it again.
Yep. I mean, last year, 1 decommit. This year, the eve of signing day, they've had 3 decommits, which is still an incredibly low number, which goes to show you, and this is also a comment from last summer's podcast where the type of guy Schiano says they're getting, and then he mentioned, like, just because we're on a losing skid, those guys we don't want in the program. And we said that was correct with a caveat. The caveat being yes, one loss shouldn't make a guy decommit, but it's how you bounce back from it as a program to show that you can, and they did. So again, I just keep looking at, like, they're playing good football right now, and at the end of the day, that matters more than anything else.
Agreed. Agreed. And we'll probably get into it a little bit when we talk about the recruiting class. But to be fair, NIL is part of that as well. And I think that helped keep the class together. But
Yes.
it also helped build the class. But I think, again, NIL is everywhere, right? So if you don't believe in the coaches, if you don't believe in the future of the program, you're not going to stay. So I think that there's still a lot of value there and a lot of credit to Schiano and the staff and how they finished this season. More to come as we learn of the bowl game and as this recruiting class gets cemented. We'll be back to talk about that first, and then the bowl game obviously being announced on Sunday. But David Anderson, thanks so much for your time once again, and thank you for listening and watching once again here at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.